Her name was Clara Jensen, though those who served beside her still called her CJ. She had worn the Marine Corps uniform for nearly a decade, carrying the weight of battles that were often fought as much within the soul as on distant, scorched ground. To anyone who met her after service, she seemed quiet, almost reserved, but behind that composure was a woman who had learned to steady her breath in the darkest nights, who had carried others through storms both literal and unseen. Clara lived simply after her discharge. A small apartment above a laundromat in a sleepy town gave her a modest roof, and a local cafe gave her steady work. She preferred the early shifts, when the sky was still soft with dawn and the air smelled faintly of rain-soaked pavement. There was a rhythm in setting out coffee cups, wiping down tables, and listening to the low hum of morning traffic. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave her something the battlefield never had: quiet. Yet silence came with its own shadows. Sometimes, while pouring coffee, she would hear in her mind the metallic clang of boots on gravel, or the distant hum of rotors slicing the air. She never spoke of those things, but they lingered in the spaces between her words. Coworkers noticed the faraway look in her eyes when certain songs played on the radio or when a customer in uniform walked in. Clara always managed a polite smile, but the ache never quite left her. It was on one such morning that the thread of her story began to change. The cafe smelled of fresh cinnamon rolls, and the first light of day poured through wide glass windows. Clara moved with practiced ease, apron tied snug, hair tucked back neatly. She didn't think herself extraordinary, just a woman doing her part, as she always had. But sometimes, the smallest of choices carry echoes far greater than we can see. At the door, she noticed him. A man older than her by a generation, his steps slow and measured, a cane tapping gently against the tiled floor. His jacket bore the patches of a veteran, one of those quiet signals only certain eyes notice. But it wasn't the man alone who caught Clara's attention, it was the dog at his side. A lean, aging Labrador with cloudy eyes, tethered close but loyal, the kind of companion whose devotion was measured not in words, but in years of silent, steady presence. The man looked hesitant as he entered. Clara greeted him softly, and when she knelt to pat the dog's head, her voice caught in her throat. "Beautiful friend you've got here," she murmured, running her fingers across the Labrador's graying fur. The veteran smiled faintly, though his eyes hinted at weariness. He ordered nothing more than a black coffee, likely the limit of what he could afford. Clara noticed the way he broke off part of his own muffin, crumbling it carefully into his palm for the dog to eat. Something in that sight, an old Marine feeding his only companion crumbs, stirred something deep within her. Without hesitation, she walked back to the kitchen and quietly fixed a small plate of scrambled eggs, setting it down gently on the floor beside the Labrador. "How special," she whispered with a wink. The dog's tail thumped against the floor, and the veteran's eyes brimmed with unshed gratitude. But compassion, simple as it may seem, often carries a cost in places where rules are rigid. Her manager noticed. A sharp voice called from behind the counter, reminding her that food wasn't free, that the cafe had policies, that kindness was not part of the job description. Clara bowed her head respectfully, but she didn't apologize. She had learned long ago that there were moments when following orders was less important than being human. By the end of her shift, she was called into the back office. The decision was swift, her explanation brushed aside. "We can't afford generosity," the manager said coldly, handing her the final paycheck in an envelope. Clara listened, hands still, her expression unreadable. She had stood at attention before commanders and watched lives shatter in the heat of battle. This moment, though humiliating, could not break her. She walked out without protest, apron folded neatly across her arm, the scent of coffee and cinnamon clinging faintly to her clothes. Outside, the day had warmed, sunlight spilling across the street. Clara sat on the curb for a moment, her breath slow, her eyes closing against the heaviness of it all. Losing a job wasn't the same as losing comrades, but the sting of dismissal still carried the familiar echo of being unseen, unvalued. She pressed her palms together, steadying herself, whispering words only she could hear, small reminders that dignity could not be taken by circumstance. What Clara did not know, as she rose to leave, was that her act of quiet defiance had already begun to ripple outward. The veteran she had helped had made a call, his voice trembling with both pride and disbelief. He had told a story to men he once marched alongside, men who still carried the fire of service in their hearts. And those men, Marines, bound by loyalty that never faded, were already gathering. For Clara, the day felt like an ending. For others, it was only the beginning of a story about to unfold. Clara walked home slowly that afternoon, her boots scuffing the uneven pavement. The envelope with her final paycheck felt thin in her hand, almost insubstantial, like the worth assigned to her years of steady work. Above, laundry lines fluttered from narrow balconies, shirts and sheets dancing in the soft wind. The world looked unchanged, yet inside her chest, there was a hollowness, a quiet ache not for the job itself, but for the injustice threaded through its ending. She let herself into her apartment, the familiar creak of the wooden stairs groaning beneath her. The space was simple, a second-hand couch against the wall, a stack of books about history and healing on the coffee table, and a single photograph framed on the shelf. In it, she stood in her uniform, flanked by two fellow Marines whose smiles carried the kind of fierce, unspoken loyalty that could outlast distance or death. Clara touched the edge of the frame lightly, letting the memory of them steady her. But the silence of the room pressed close. She sat down heavily, shoulders slumping, and pressed her hands together. The café had been more than wages. It had been a place where she could keep her restlessness at bay, a place where the clatter of plates and the steady hiss of the espresso machine drowned out echoes of faraway nights. Now, without it, the walls felt too close, the air too still. Her phone buzzed, a message from a former comrade she hadn't spoken to in months. "Heard what you did. Proud of you, CJ." Clara blinked, uncertain how word had traveled so fast. She placed the phone face down, not ready to confront the weight of praise she didn't feel she deserved. To her, it had been instinct. Helping a fellow veteran and his dog was simply what anyone with a heart should do. Evening came. The town outside grew quieter, traffic fading into the hum of crickets and the occasional bark of a dog. Clara brewed herself a cup of tea, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured. She hated the tremor. It felt like weakness, though she knew it was only the body's echo of too many nights spent on edge, too many years of vigilance. She pressed the warm mug to her lips and let the steam fog her glasses, grounding herself in something small and ordinary. But when she tried to sleep, the day replayed in her mind, the look of the manager's cold eyes, the veteran's silent gratitude, the dog's wagging tail. She stared at the ceiling, lit faintly by the glow of street lamps outside, and whispered to herself, "You did the right thing." The words felt fragile, but she clung to them. The following morning, Clara dressed as if for work out of habit. Simple jeans, her boots polished, hair pulled back. Old rhythms died hard. She walked the streets aimlessly, unsure where to go. Passing the café, she paused to cross the street. Through the glass, she could see the same tables, the same scent of fresh coffee drifting into the air. But without her inside, the place felt hollow, stripped of the quiet compassion she used to carry into each shift. A flicker of doubt entered her chest. Had she made her own trouble? Wouldn't it have been easier to just look away, to let the man feed his dog crumbs in silence? Yet even as the thought surfaced, her heart resisted. Some rules were made to be broken, she reminded herself, and some moments were worth the price of consequence. She walked on. At the park, children's laughter rang bright, mingling with the rustle of leaves. Clara sat on a bench and closed her eyes, letting the sounds wash over her. Somewhere nearby, a service dog barked, the tone sharp but loyal. She opened her eyes to see a young woman in a wheelchair, the Labrador at her side guiding her carefully across the path. The sight stirred something gentle in Clara's chest. Dogs, she thought, carried burdens humans sometimes could not, their loyalty unshaken, their patience endless. Perhaps saving the veteran's dog yesterday had been less about breaking Café rules and more about honoring a truth she'd always known, that care, freely given, was never wasted. By late afternoon, her steps carried her toward the town square, where the flagpole stood tall, its colors rippling in the breeze. She stopped, staring at the stars and stripes, her throat tightening. It wasn't patriotism that filled her, it was memory. The smell of dust in faraway deserts, the sound of boots in formation, the weight of duty pressed into her bones. She pressed her palm to her chest, steadying herself against the rush of recollections. That was when she heard it, the low rumble of engines. Not the distant whine of trucks or cars, but something heavier, more disciplined. She turned her head. Down the street, a convoy of military vehicles rolled slowly toward the square. Sunlight glinted off polished metal and insignias. Her breath caught. They weren't here for a parade. Pedestrians stopped, watching curiously as the vehicles drew closer, dust kicking up in their wake. Clara stood frozen, her boots rooted to the ground. The sound of tires against asphalt was steady, unyielding, the kind of sound that carried authority. She recognized the formation instantly, Marines. The sight was both familiar and surreal. Men and women in uniforms stepping down, their movements sharp, deliberate. For a moment, Clara thought she was dreaming. Then she realized they were walking with purpose, heading straight toward her. The town square fell into a hush. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, whispering questions. Clara's pulse quickened, a mix of unease and something else she couldn't yet name. She straightened instinctively, her spine rigid, her shoulders squared, the way she had once stood at attention. As the Marines approached, their boots striking the ground in perfect rhythm, Clara's breath trembled. Whatever was about to unfold, she knew her life was shifting again. This was no coincidence. And beneath her fear, a flicker of something else began to stir, an old, unforgotten strength rising quietly within her. The Marines stopped only a few paces from where Clara stood, their boots halting in a rhythm that seemed to echo through the square. The late afternoon light caught the edges of their dress uniforms, the metals polished so bright they seemed to burn against the fabric. A silence rippled outward, shopkeepers pausing mid-sentence, children craning their necks. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Clara's pulse hammered. Her instinct told her to step back, to fade into the crowd, but her body betrayed her. Her boots remained planted firmly on the warm stone of the square. The lead officer, a tall man with salt and pepper hair beneath his cover, raised his chin, eyes steady on her. There was no hostility in his gaze, only a quiet intensity, the kind she recognized from nights spent on the edge of danger. "Clara Jensen?" His voice carried clearly, calm but firm. She swallowed, her throat dry, and gave a small nod. The officer stepped forward, and as he did, the others behind him shifted, their formation loosening into something less formal, more human. These were not strangers. They were Marines, her people, even if years and distance had drawn lines between them. "We heard what happened yesterday," the officer continued, "and we're not here to let it pass unnoticed." Clara blinked, her breath catching. Around her, the townsfolk murmured, a ripple of curiosity weaving through the crowd. She shook her head faintly, overwhelmed. "It wasn't anything," she said, her voice low, nearly swallowed by the open air. But the officer shook his head with quiet conviction. "It was everything. You honored one of our own, and you honored what it means to wear this uniform, even if you weren't wearing it anymore." His words settled over her like a weight, not heavy with burden but heavy with truth. Behind him, one of the younger Marines stepped forward, cradling something in his hands. It was a folded flag, edges crisp, the fabric catching in the sunlight. Clara's chest tightened at the sight. The young Marine looked at her with eyes shining, a respect deeper than words. "This is for you," he said softly. Clara's breath shuddered as he placed the flag into her arms. The fabric was cool, familiar, carrying with it the scent of starch and ceremony. She held it close, the memories rising unbidden. Standing in formation under a searing sun, saluting as comrades were laid to rest, the quiet honor stitched into every thread. Her eyes burned, but she did not look away. "I only did what was right," she whispered. "That," the officer replied, his voice thick with emotion, "is what makes you one of us, always." The crowd around them was silent now, moved by the gravity of the moment. A few people wiped their eyes. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "She's a hero." Clara heard it, and her lips trembled at the word. She had never thought of herself that way. Not in war, not in peace, not yesterday in the cafe. The Marines stood with her for a long moment, a living wall of solidarity. She felt their presence seep into her bones, grounding her, reminding her that the bond forged in service never truly frayed. Though her uniform now hung in the back of her closet, though her days were filled with ordinary work and quiet routines, here she stood, acknowledged, seen, honored. Her hands trembled as she pressed the folded flag to her chest. She closed her eyes briefly, whispering inwardly a thank you to all those she had served beside, those living and those long gone. The square felt sacred in that moment, as if time itself had paused to let her breathe again. When she opened her eyes, the officer stepped closer. His tone softened, less formal now. "We're staying in town for a few days. If you'll let us, we'd like to take you to dinner tonight. No uniforms. Just Marines. Family." Clara's lips parted, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. She had grown used to solitude, to carrying her stories silently. But here was an invitation, not of pity, but of belonging. Her throat tightened. "I'd like that," she managed, her voice small but steady. A smile flickered at the corners of the officer's mouth, and he nodded. With that, the formation eased. One by one, the Marines extended their hands, brief touches of camaraderie, the kind of gestures that said, "We see you, we stand with you." Clara shook each hand, her fingers lingering, her chest swelling with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. As the convoy rolled away and the square slowly returned to its ordinary hum, Clara remained standing, the folded flag pressed firmly against her heart. The townsfolk glanced at her with newfound respect, no longer seeing just a quiet waitress or a woman passing through. They saw her now for what she truly was, a veteran who had carried her service into every act of compassion, even the smallest. She stood alone again, yet not alone at all. The silence felt different now, less heavy, less suffocating. It was a silence filled with presence, with the invisible threads of loyalty and gratitude weaving around her. Clara lifted her gaze to the horizon, the last of the daylight spilling gold across the rooftops. She thought of the veteran and his dog, of the way kindness had rippled outward beyond anything she could have imagined. A single act, she realized, could call forth an army, not of force, but of recognition, of love, of solidarity. And in that realization, she felt her chest lighten, as if a door long closed had finally opened. That evening, Clara walked through town with the folded flag still in her arms, its weight both grounding and gentle. The streets were lined with warm lights spilling from shop windows, the scent of fresh bread lingering from the bakery, and the distant sound of a guitar drifting from a corner bar. Life went on as it always did, ordinary and unhurried. But for Clara, the world no longer felt the same. She had thought herself invisible, just another face pouring coffee, another veteran fading quietly into civilian life. Yet now, she carried proof that she had been seen. The flag against her chest was not a decoration but a recognition, a reminder that compassion mattered, that service never truly ended. When she reached her apartment, Clara set the flag carefully on her table. She stared at it for a long while, her fingers brushing the folds. In the quiet, memories came alive, comrades laughing around a makeshift fire, the thud of helicopters overhead, the salt sting of sweat on long marches. They were not all easy memories, but tonight they felt different. Softer, less like wounds, more like scars she could finally touch without flinching. Later, she met the Marines for dinner at a small diner on the edge of town. They kept their word, no uniforms, no formality. They sat in a corner booth, trading stories, their voices low but filled with laughter and the kind of honesty only those who have known hardship can share. Clara listened more than she spoke, but when she did, the words surprised her. She found herself telling stories she had locked away for years: the heat of the desert, the bond of patrols at dawn, the ache of loss carried in silence. The others listened with reverence, nodding, their eyes reflecting the same ghosts. In that space, she was not a stranger. She was one of them again. And though her hands trembled at times, behind her smile there was a quiet strength reclaiming its place. After dinner, one of the younger Marines, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice full of fire, walked with Clara outside. The night air was cool, the skies stretched wide with stars. "You know," the younger Marine said, "what you did wasn't small. People forget that kindness can be its own form of courage. But we don't forget." Clara turned to her, the street lamp casting a soft glow across their faces. "It didn't feel like courage," she admitted. "It just felt necessary." "That's what makes it brave," the woman replied. The words lingered with Clara long after they parted ways. In the days that followed, something began to shift. Strangers in town smiled at her differently, their eyes warmer, more knowing. A child approached her outside the market and shyly handed her a drawing, a picture of a woman holding a flag, a dog by her side. Clara's throat tightened as she thanked him, folding the paper carefully into her bag. She found herself waking with a new steadiness. The mornings still held their echoes, the imagined thud of boots, the scent of sand carried in memory, but they no longer weighed her down. Instead, she rose with a sense of purpose, small but real. She volunteered at the local shelter, walking dogs for veterans who couldn't manage it themselves. She began writing letters to old comrades, reconnecting piece by piece. And in the quiet of her apartment, she sometimes sat with the flag in her lap, whispering promises to those she had lost. "I am still here. I am still carrying forward." One evening, she returned to the cafe, not as an employee, but as a customer. She sat by the window, ordered a coffee, and watched the world pass by. The chair where the old veteran had sat was empty now, but in her mind she saw him and his Labrador, the tail thumping, the crumbs scattered on the floor. She smiled softly, not with regret, but with gratitude. That moment, simple as it was, had changed everything. Clara knew her life would never be a parade. It would be small acts, quiet days, unseen battles fought within. But she had learned something vital, that dignity is not granted by titles or uniforms, but by the choices we make when no one is watching. As dusk fell, she stepped outside, the air cool against her skin. The flag rested on her shoulder in its case, a steady weight. She paused in the middle of the street, looking up at the fading sky. The first stars blinked into view, fragile but defiant. She breathed deeply, the night filling her lungs. For the first time in years, she felt whole, not because her scars had vanished, but because she finally saw them for what they were: proof of survival, of resilience, of love. Her story was not finished, and she no longer wished it to be. There were still people to meet, still small kindnesses to give, still a future waiting quietly to be lived. Tonight, she walked forward with steady steps, carrying not only her flag but also the hope that had been reignited. She was Clara Jensen, veteran, sister, friend. And though the world might forget her name, the flame she carried would not be extinguished. Because even in the quietest lives, there are moments when compassion roars louder than any battle, and where one act of humanity becomes the thread that binds us all. And in that truth, Clara found her peace. The weeks that followed were quieter, but not empty. Clara settled into a rhythm that felt new and fragile, like a song she had once known but was only now remembering. Mornings began with the scent of fresh coffee from the corner cafe. Though she no longer worked there, she allowed herself the small luxury of sitting near the window, her journal open, the folded flag resting in its case beside her. People recognized her now. They nodded, offered a word of respect, sometimes just a smile that carried a silent acknowledgement. Clara never sought the attention. She wore it gently, like a scarf placed over her shoulders by someone else. Still, she noticed how the town had shifted. The veteran she had helped return to the cafe with his Labrador, and this time, no one dared look at him with suspicion or pity. Instead, customers bent to pet the dog, and the barista slipped a small plate of scrambled eggs onto the floor without hesitation. Clara, watching from her seat, felt a warmth spread through her chest. Compassion had taken root. In the afternoons, she began to walk to the shelter more often, her boots scuffing the sidewalk, her heart finding calm in the company of dogs waiting for homes. She brushed their coats, spoke softly to them, and sometimes just sat in silence, their heads resting on her lap. Each wag of a tail, each trusting glance, reminded her of something she had nearly forgotten, that even in brokenness, there is loyalty, and even in silence, love endures. But nights remained more complicated. Dreams carried her back to the desert, to dust and heat, to the sharp cries that still echoed through her memory. Sometimes she woke with her hands clenched, heart racing, breath shallow. Yet instead of sitting in the dark alone, she began to write. Words poured onto paper, not perfect, not polished, but real. She wrote about service, about the cost of compassion, about the dog at the cafe, and the Marines in the square. She wrote because it steadied her, and because the stories deserved to exist outside her chest. One evening, she gathered the courage to share a piece aloud. The diner had begun hosting open nights for poetry and stories, and though her voice shook as she approached the microphone, she read slowly, each word carrying the weight of her truth. The room was still listening. When she finished, silence hung for a heartbeat, then applause rose, warm and unrestrained. Clara bowed her head, overwhelmed, but in that moment, she felt something she had longed for. Connection without uniform, recognition without rank. The Marines who had come to stand with her returned to their duties in time, but they did not vanish. Letters arrived in her mailbox, handwritten and full of humor, updates from across the country and across the sea. Sometimes they called. She answered every time. Through them, she remembered that service did not end with discharge. It evolved, stretching like threads between lives, binding them still. As autumn edged into the town, Clara began to walk with the veteran and his Labrador in the evenings. Their pace was slow, measured, but steady. He told her stories of his own service, and she listened, grateful for the quiet bond between them. Sometimes they spoke of loss, sometimes of laughter, sometimes they simply walked, the dog padding faithfully between them. She realized then that healing was not a solitary act. It was shared, carried together like a flag between many hands. One morning, as she set out for the shelter, Clara paused at her doorway, her gaze lifting to the horizon. The sky was painted with a wash of pale pink and gold, the kind of fragile beauty that reminded her of dawn patrols in faraway lands. She closed her eyes, letting the chill air fill her lungs. For so long, she had thought peace was something distant, unreachable. But here, in the stillness, she felt it beginning, not perfect, not permanent, but real. She whispered a quiet promise, more to herself than to the world. I will keep going. I will keep choosing compassion. I will not forget. That evening, the town square came alive with lanterns strung between buildings. Children laughed, running beneath them, their voices bright against the night. Clara walked slowly through the crowd, the flag resting at home, but carried still within her. Strangers greeted her with warmth, neighbors clasped her hand. She felt the threads of belonging weaving tighter, no longer fragile but strong. She stopped at the fountain in the center of the square. The water shimmered beneath the glow of lantern light, and for a moment, she saw her reflection, older, lined with scars both visible and unseen, but softened by the quiet strength in her eyes. She smiled. Her journey was not a headline, not a parade. It was smaller, quieter, an unfolding path of healing, compassion, and shared humanity. And yet, she knew now that those quiet stories mattered. They were the ones that changed hearts, the ones that rippled outward until a single act of kindness became a movement no one could ignore. Clara Jensen stood there, hands resting at her sides, her heart steady. She was not defined by what had been taken from her, nor by the battles fought in silence. She was defined by what she had chosen to give and what she would continue to give. And as the lanterns swayed gently in the evening breeze, Clara understood. This was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a life lived forward, rooted in resilience, carried by compassion, and illuminated by hope. The first frost came softly, dusting the rooftops in silver and veiling the ground in a quiet shimmer. Clara stood at her window that morning, her palms pressed to the glass, watching the world exhale in white wisps. The air felt sharper now, but the town seemed gentler somehow, as though winter invited people to draw nearer, to warm each other with small kindnesses. She pulled her scarf around her neck and stepped outside, the crunch of frost beneath her boots reminding her of nights when sand had shifted beneath her feet instead. Memory clung like breath on cold air. Her routine at the shelter had deepened into something more than service. Dogs that once trembled at the edge of their cages now greeted her with wagging tails. A shepherd mix, scarred but steady, leaned against her leg each day, as if claiming her as his own. She found herself speaking to him in the same tone she once used with soldiers, firm, reassuring, threaded with trust. And in his amber eyes, she recognized the same hunger she had carried, the longing to belong, to be seen as more than broken. That evening, as she walked home, she noticed the church by the square glowing with candlelight. A sign outside read Veterans Vigil, all welcome. She paused, her hand brushing the wood of the doorframe, her chest tightening. For a long time, she had avoided gatherings like this. The weight of silence between prayers often felt unbearable, as though it demanded answers she could not give. But something stirred in her tonight, a quiet pull. She stepped inside. The sanctuary was filled with the warm scent of wax and cedar. People sat scattered across the pews, older veterans with heavy coats, young families holding photographs, neighbors with heads bowed in respect. At the front stood a simple table draped with folded flags, each one a silent story. Clara's gaze lingered there, her breath catching. She slid into the last row, her hands clasped in her lap, and listened as names were read aloud, one by one. Each name echoed like a bell, steady, deliberate, leaving space for remembrance. Clara closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. With each name, she felt the weight of absence but also the persistence of presence, the way memory refused to be extinguished. When her own whispered prayers came, they were not for herself, but for those whose stories had ended too soon. She prayed that their voices would remain in the world, carried by those still walking. After the vigil, she lingered by the steps of the church, her breath rising in small clouds. An older woman approached, her coat buttoned tightly, her hands wrapped around a small candle. "You're Clara Jensen, aren't you?" she asked gently. Clara nodded. The woman's eyes softened. "My son spoke of you once. He said you reminded him of what service really means." She placed the candle in Clara's hand. "Thank you for still carrying it." Then she was gone, swallowed by the night, leaving Clara with the flame trembling in her palm. She walked home slowly, the candle shielded against the wind. Inside, she placed it by the folded flag on her shelf, the two lights, one steady, one eternal, keeping watch together. For the first time, her apartment no longer felt like a place of waiting. It felt lived in, alive. The following days brought more small transformations. Clara's writing, once private, began to find its way beyond her journal. The diner asked if they could publish her stories in their local paper. She hesitated, her pen hovering over the release form, but then remembered the eyes that had listened so intently at the open mic night.
She signed.
Soon, neighbors greeted her with words not just of thanks, but of recognition. "I read what you wrote. It stayed with me." With every story shared, she realized she was not reliving the past. She was reshaping it, offering it back to the world in a way that could heal rather than haunt. Her scars did not disappear, but they began to feel less like barriers and more like markers of the journey she had walked. Winter deepened, and one evening, she joined the veteran and his Labrador for another walk. Snowflakes drifted softly, catching in the dog's fur, melting against their coats. The veteran spoke of a dream he'd had, of sitting in the sun without pain. Clara listened, her hand brushing against the fur of the dog as they walked. She thought of her own dreams, the ones where she still woke gasping, and realized that though they hadn't vanished, their edges were softening. When they reached the square, lanterns hung once again, glowing against the snow. Children raced across the frost, their laughter ringing like bells. Clara tilted her head back, watching the lanterns sway. They reminded her of the candles she had been given, of the flame she carried now not as a burden, but as a light. She turned to the veteran beside her. "You ever think," she asked softly, "that maybe survival isn't just about getting through the worst of it? Maybe it's about learning to hold the best of it, too." He nodded, his gaze on the lanterns. "Maybe that's the part no one teaches us," he replied. "But maybe it's the part that matters most." They stood there together, the dog sitting patiently at their feet, the snow quiet around them. Clara felt the threads of connection weaving tighter still, not only to him, not only to the town, but to herself. She had not lost the war within her, not completely. She was learning to live alongside it, to find moments where compassion and memory could exist together without tearing her apart. As the lanterns flickered overhead, Clara Jensen closed her eyes and breathed. This was not the end of her healing. It was not even the middle, but it was enough. Enough to step forward, enough to believe that the light she carried could guide her into whatever lay ahead. And for the first time in years, she felt the quiet certainty of hope settle deep within her bones.